everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming to this last session today on biologics' contribution to global health. And it's really focused on innovation in health and the role of biologic medicines. My name is Janice Burnett, and today I'm with the IFPMA, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. We're a global biopharmaceutical organization working on health, regulatory, and trade issues. And we're here along with our co-host, IAPO, the International Alliance for Patient Organizations. And with today's session, we're really hoping that we'll be able to provide you with a platform where different stakeholders with different views can share various perspectives in a very meaningful way. And we're very excited that we are making this session be focused around the patient perspective, and we really hope that there will be some very good dialogue. What I would like to do and get started is just to run through quickly today's objectives. We're really looking at understanding the value and changes of innovation in health, looking at what is really the role of biologic medicines in responding to health innovation, the needs that are out there. What can biologic medicines offer to patients, healthcare providers, and caregivers? And really, is there a multi-sectoral commitment that we should be looking at to help advance biologics policy action and sustainable and equitable access and innovation in health? So one of the things I wanted to do before we get started is just really to have a sense of who is in the room today, who's interested in coming to this session. So I was hoping if we could have by a raise of hands, I'm going to mention a few groups. By no means are they exclusive, and just ask to see where you're coming from. So I'm curious to see who is the room is a business or an industry professional, pharmaceutical industry or other. Okay, a few hands, thank you very much. Student or academic? Okay. Patient or patient representative? Okay. Healthcare provider? All right, it's nice to see. And then how about policymaker or government official and/or? Great. Well, thank you. That really helps us, get ready to lead this dialogue. And I would like to now introduce my colleague, Matthias Weinold, who is from IAPO, and he'll get us moving today. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Janice, for introducing the session. I have the pleasure now to briefly introduce to you the International Alliance of Patient Organizations. My name, can I have the next slide, please? Oh, I can have it here. The International Alliance of Patient Organizations. My name is Matthias Weinold. I'm a member of the board of the organization and its treasurer. We are an NGO in official relationship with the World Health Organization and one of the few patient organizations in this capacity. Our vision, which we're bringing as a background to this workshop, is to see patients at the center of healthcare worldwide and to build a patient-centered healthcare globally. We are an organization with 276 member organizations from 71 countries representing 51 specific disease areas. You may also recognize that some of our organizations are not disease specific, and IAPO itself is not a disease specific organization. As part of our activities, we and our member organizations engage in patient mobilization, in the development of partnerships with patient organizations and other stakeholders in the health industry and in policy making, participating actually in policy making and policy education as civil society organizations, providing effective messaging and strategy formulation on key issues in healthcare provision, and here specifically on patient-centered care, the entire issue of social marketing to publics, to policy elites, of healthcare issues and of patients' interests in healthcare, developing the right and appropriate PR and communication plans around health innovations. This is surely one of the efforts we're taking to actually look at something that is new. working with our members on national through-the-line approaches, mostly based on legal approaches, enshrining patient rights in national legal systems, and also, more recently, over the last 20 years, we've been engaged in human rights-based approaches. If you want to learn more about IAPO and our patient organization, our member organizations, please look up the website that I list here. I now have the pleasure of introducing, I don't have the pleasure of introducing. Janice is first having the pleasure of introducing the first speaker. Thank you.
So I would like to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Georg Markmann. He's a professor of medical ethics at the University of Munich, and today he'll be speaking to us about ethical approaches to innovation in global health. So I'd like you to please welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this session at the end of a long day. I will start with some remarks on the background. The background we have to take into account if we talk about innovation in healthcare, and especially in the Western societies, we have a demographic change. We live in an aging society. We have more chronic and chronic degenerative diseases. We have an increasing incidence of cancer. And this results in an increasing demand for medical and nursing care, of course, with increasing costs. This is just one factor that plays into the background. Another factor are medical innovations. That's actually what we are talking about. These medical innovations increase the demand because more diseases can be treated. So this also will increase the costs of care. At the same time, we have limited financial resources in public healthcare systems, so only a limited supply of medical and nursing care can be financed. And as a result, we have an increasing gap between an increasing demand for medical and nursing care and limited financial resources, with a resulting increasing scarcity of healthcare resources. And the question is, how can we deal with these challenges? How can we respond to this scarcity? And there are basically two different possibilities. One is eliminating waste, increasing efficiency in the healthcare systems, and there are many examples that there is still a lot to do, and this will be a task for the next years, and actually a never-ending task, because there will never be perfect efficiency in the healthcare system like in any other areas of society. But I'm pretty sure that increasing efficiency, eliminating waste will not be sufficient to close the gap between the increasing demand and the limited financial resources. So I think we will have to talk about priorities in healthcare, talk about what is more or less important in the healthcare system to make a wise usage of limited healthcare resources. What is priority setting? And I'm talking about explicit priority setting. It is the explicit evidence-based determination what is more or less important in healthcare based on clearly defined ethical criteria with the goal to direct limited healthcare resources to those areas where they are needed most. Not just let the healthcare system grow as it grows incidentally, but direct healthcare resources to those areas where the need for healthcare is the biggest. In most of the current healthcare systems, there is no explicit priority setting, but there are many implicit priorities implemented in the system by financing infrastructures, by the reimbursement of services, by the regulation of providers, and market expectations, for example, of the industry. And these built-in priorities in the system, they often do not match primary health needs of the populations. So I think there is something to win if we engage in explicit priority setting. And I think today we are basically talking about the question, what role shall or can biologics play in the healthcare system? You could also say, what priority should these new developments, these innovative strategies have in the healthcare system? And if you look at it from a perspective of priority setting, there are different levels on which you can talk, you can deliberate about priorities. There are the first two levels where you talk about the allocation of research resources. So the question is, how much research efforts shall we put into biologics? And there are two different levels, sub-levels. The one is allocation of resources into biologics versus alternative ways to promote health, prevent and treat diseases. And the second level is allocation of resources within the field of biologics, because that's a huge field, and we'll talk about this later more in detail. And within the field of biologics, you can decide, well, where should the main resources for research and development go? And then if you have the products on the market, then the question is, who should get access? How shall the products, the biologicals, be distributed? That would be the third layer. And I will briefly touch on these three different levels of distribution and allocation and priority setting in the following. The first level, the question is allocation of resources into biologics versus other alternatives. And I think the central issue is whether the high investment in biologicals is the right priority. Is it really directed towards priority health needs of the population, or could we perhaps get a higher health gain if resources are invested in other approaches, including prevention? And another another aspect is important from an ethical perspective, are existing inequalities in health status taken into account when we decide how much resources should go into the field of biologics. Medical ethicists very often just raise issues, and they do not give any answers or just perspectives for solutions. So for each of the challenges I will raise, I will try to give some policy perspectives. And one policy perspective would be explicit priority setting in public funding for research, which reflects the healthcare needs in an aging society, and with priority for disadvantaged subpopulations, and with the potential for improving health status in the population. An interesting question is whether we should put priority on common diseases. So common problems should have priority in developing new medications. And another interesting question is whether cost effectiveness should also play a major role in setting priorities. And the second option would be to set incentives for pharmaceutical companies to invest in areas with high public health priority. The second level would be the question, how do we distribute resources within the field of biologics? And there is a little danger that especially pharmaceutical industries invest mainly in profitable areas, so populations with rare profiles may be neglected. So populations, small subpopulations, because it won't be able to make a profit if you develop medications for these subpopulations, and this could result in orphan populations, so neglected patient populations, and that with the result of a neglect of vulnerable, already disadvantaged subpopulations of society. And another question is, well, if biologics is a very attractive strategy The question is, will there be enough research with patient subgroups beyond biologics? And if there is not a lot of research, then there may be a higher risk through insufficiently tested interventions. So what policy options could there be to answer or to respond to these challenges? We could have incentives for investment by pharmaceutical industry in orphan populations. We do have extensive currently orphan drug regulation, so there already are incentives in place. And again, we could direct public research funding, especially to rare patient populations, and say, well, these are neglected by the mainstream research and development by the pharmaceutical industry, so this is something where public spending, public research funding should jump in. One challenge could be that there will be an increasing number of orphan drugs, because if drugs are tailored to the genetic subprofile of a certain patient subgroup, these subgroups will become smaller and smaller. So the question is it still profitable to develop drugs for these small populations? Again, you could say, well, this is something where you should have increasing public spending, but the question is, well, can we do this indefinitely? There will be also limits for public spending. The third level would be the distribution of biologics if they come onto the market. And there is a challenge that many innovative biologicals are quite expensive, which raises questions of affordability in modern healthcare systems, which usually operate under quite tight financial constraints. So the question is, do public healthcare systems have to set limits, for example, based on cost-effectiveness assessment, like the National Health Service in the UK does it? And there is one problem. At the time of licensing of the drug, very often the effectiveness and the benefit for the patient is not yet clear under routine conditions, because the licensing studies here usually assess efficacy, not effectiveness and benefit, under ideal conditions with a selected, not really representative sample. They often use surrogate endpoints instead of patient-relevant endpoints. Instead of patient-relevant endpoints like overall survival and quality of life. And often there is no head-to-head comparison with standard treatment, and sometimes incomplete data transparency. There is an incomplete reporting of data and publication bias. You know that studies with positive results, they are more likely to get studies than studies with negative results, where you could not show that the new innovative drug was better. So the requirements for a needs-oriented and fair allocation of distributions are often not met. So if healthcare systems like the German healthcare system with the early benefit assessment, they try to assess the patient-relevant benefit right upon the licensing, they do not really have a valid data basis, which is a problem, because then you may misjudge the innovations that are out there. So I think in terms of policy perspectives, I think the first...
It cannot be done alone, we need to partner. In the picture you see what we call a community life center that we have helped build in Kiambu County, Kenya. Philips implemented there the first phase 2 years ago,
another different
and it included
talk.
basic infrastructure, offering off-grid energy and basic hygiene,
continue talking against the
equipment,
transmission.
enabling women to deliver...
Oh yeah, okay, that's great. Now it's me again. So the first step we would have to do to improve the effectiveness and benefit assessment, so probably we need more independent, publicly financed clinical studies after licensing of the drug with patient-relevant outcomes. And one option would be initially just coverage in clinical studies. So if there are new medications that are licensed and we want to bring them to the patient, we just don't distribute them in the healthcare system, but we use them just in clinical studies to gain the knowledge that's still missing. As I already said, in Germany, the benefit assessment according to the AMNOG is a little too early, because especially for biologics, we often do not have the relevant knowledge. The second would be improved decision-making on the micro level. I think that's something we probably will talk about later on. Patients should be fully informed about the benefits and risks of new treatments and alternatives. For example, if we have anti-cancer medications, they should be informed that palliative care may be an alternative in advanced oncological disease, and we should improve the decision-making in terms of a shared decision-making and respect patient preferences. And the last perspective would be cost-effectiveness assessment. So if we do have good data about effectiveness and benefits, then we can try to assess the relationship between the incremental effectiveness, incremental benefit, and the incremental costs. Okay, so far a first input from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and you will have the chance to listen again to the transmission.
I will be waiting a second till the colleague from the Netherlands goes back to his room. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience as well. I hope you can understand me now. I have the great pleasure to introduce to you my colleague on the board of the International Alliance of Patient Organizations until a couple of weeks ago, when she stepped down, Doreen Wong-Rieger. Doreen is President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, one of the groups that was just addressed in the presentation, the rare disorders. And Doreen is also chair of the Consumer Advocate Network in Canada. Thank you very much, Doreen.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you for readjusting the podium as well so that we can be seen as well as see you. It is really my great pleasure to be able to be here at the World Health Summit and to really have a patient perspective as part of this panel, but also at the summit. I think, as Janice indicated when she did the poll, there isn't a whole lot of engagement of patients at this summit, and we've heard about this summit over the last couple of years, and certainly I was really thrilled when I was asked to be a part of this panel because it gives us an opportunity to be here. But it also hopefully helps us raise the importance of having direct patient engagement and really brings back to, I think, the issue of patients being at the center, which also means, though, that patients have a direct role in terms of healthcare at every single level. So I'm truly delighted to be a part of this panel. And really next year, when we're here, I want Janice to ask that question. I want to see a whole lot of hands up in that audience. So think about how you're going to get the patients here. No, really very much. And I'm really pleased to be able to chair this panel as we're moving forward. So we're going to change formats just a little bit. We're going to have 4 speakers. We're going to present a very brief presentation, one right after the other, and then we're going to open it up into a panel discussion. So I'm going to introduce the entire panel, and then I'll ask each of them to come up here to do their presentation, and then we'll open it up in terms of discussion among the panel and also hopefully discussions with you here as not just an audience, but as participants. So we're going to open up with Brendan Shaw, who is the Assistant Director General of IFPMA, and he will be speaking a bit about it from the focus of the value to public health from the industry perspective. Professor Paul de Klerk, who is professor at University of Leuven, is going to speak to us really about focusing on biologics and the story on the history of biologics and how it is that they've become to have the role that they have and where we're transitioning. I'm going to come back up and talk to you a bit about the patient perspective, introducing a bit of the work that we've done in terms of surveys and interviews with patients, both in developed and in developing countries. And then we're going to close with Dr. Simon Pickart from the University of Illinois at Chicago, who's going to talk to us about health economics. I want to say really a huge kudos to Simon, because Simon is filling in for a colleague of his who was going to be on this panel, Alex, who ended up developing laryngitis at the last minute and felt that was not going to be very effective in terms of being a presentation. Simon just happens to be visiting as on sabbatical, and I think at 10:30 last night, I think Axel turned to him and said, I think you can do this. So we're really delighted to have Simon here and really appreciate his taking that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you. I'm a little bit taller. So. Lift it up. Fantastic. Well, look, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've been asked for about 10 minutes or so just to speak about biologics and the contribution to public health from the industry perspective. And what I'm going to do today is spend a few minutes talking about the big picture, if you like, how the drugs get developed, what the history's been in the industry, and then what possibly future opportunities there are in the future. And I think as we go through the discussion with the panel and questions, we can sort of zero in on some of the nitty-gritty issues, if you like. So what is the contribution to healthcare from biologics? Well, the world spends about $1 trillion a year on medicines in total, and about a quarter of that is on biologic medicines. So roughly somewhere between $200 and $250 billion a year the world spends on biologic medicines. And so what do we get for it? Well, there's a few things we get for it, actually. Globally, there's about 350 million patients being treated with biotherapeutic medicines around the world at any one time. Now, if you do your maths, it's about 5% of the world's population is being treated by biotherapeutic medicines, biologic medicines. And between 20 and 30 million patients with rare diseases are benefiting from biologic medicines in particular. So these are rare diseases that have been developed with biologic medicines and biological therapies and technologies. Around the last 3 decades, around the last 30 years, there's been about 260 medicines being developed, biologic medicines, and about 233 indications. And so this gives you a sense of the technological change that's happening, and I'll give you a bit of a better picture of that in a minute. But in that 30-year period, there's roughly 250-odd new medicines that have been developed that are biologics, coming out of research and out of the industry that are now available to the community. And also, there is about 1,000 medicines, biologic medicines, currently being developed in the pipeline. That's 1,000 medicines that don't exist yet. 1,000 medicines that are on their way to being reality but aren't yet here. Now, the reality of the drug development process is that not all of those will actually end up getting to the community. In fact, if you take a conservative estimate, about 10% of those will actually end up being medicines and vaccines that are used by the community. So that's about 100, 150, something like that. But you need to bear that in mind as well, those other 8 or 900 drugs that actually won't get to the community. They've still got to go through the clinical development process, because that's how the drug development process works, that's how research works, that's how a lot of the great medical breakthroughs that the community enjoys today, that's how they've been developed. But there's a lot of promise in there. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about how biologics and biotherapeutic medicines have evolved in the industry. It's a really great story, and I have shamelessly pinched this chart from, or this material from Evans and Caton's article from Health Affairs. If you want to have a read of this, I recommend this article. It's a very good article. And what's happened through the industry over the decades has been the evolution of the industry, of government regulation, of the science behind it, and then ultimately what patients are getting out of it at the end of the day. And that's what this is all about. I mean, yes, we can have successful businesses. Yes, we can have good government regulation. Yes, we can have some great science and scientists developing great new ideas. But at the end of the day, what are patients, what are the community getting out of it? And there's actually some really good stories in amongst all of this. So through and the analogy I like to use in explaining how biologics and gene testing and all of those sort of things are influencing the pharmaceutical industry, it's the analogy of what the internet did to the IT sector. And in fact, if you look at the history of what happened to medicine and to pharmaceuticals and the biotech sector, there's a lot of analogies with how the internet technology first picked up in the IT sector and then over the course of the next 30 or 40 years changed the way that IT, as we think of it, changed. So you're seeing the same things. You're seeing the 1980s where the early scientists were there and the first biotech firms were getting rolled out of universities, all very hip, and people wearing T-shirts and jeans and all those sort of things, and being an entrepreneurial culture. And also government regulation was starting to take shape as this new scientific things that people didn't really understand how they worked. New governments were scratching their heads trying to work out how to regulate it. And in that period, in the 1980s, we had some early treatments come through. Some of the insulins came through and some of the vaccines, some of the biologic vaccines and insulins came through in that period. Then we moved to the 1990s, where what you're seeing now is more science starting to realise how this works. You're starting to see many more disease mechanisms being elucidated, I think is the words used on the slide there, but working out how diseases really work. Why do some people get cancer and why not other people? Why do some people have these genetic disorders and other people not get them? This is where all the science is really starting to come home. Work on monoclonal antibodies and molecular engineering starting as well. And that's having a knock-on effect to government regulation as regulators are starting to grapple with all this, how to regulate this new sector. You're seeing more biotech approvals starting to go through the regulatory system. And you're seeing the industry grow as well. You're starting to see these companies who are embracing this and investing in it and putting a lot of risk capital and scientific know-how into this. They're the ones that are starting to succeed. And the ultimate result is that there are a lot more medicines developed. There are 63 medicines in that period in the 1990s that cover things like, for example, the first treatment for multiple sclerosis and the first treatment for cystic fibrosis, safer treatments for haemophilia, the first treatments for Gaucher's disease, sort of enzyme diseases, became manageable. And you're seeing treatments for Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis and also explosion of cancer therapies. So again, this story of the science with the business and the regulation leading at the end to treatment options for patients. This is the health outcome from this. And then fast forward to the 21st century, will be the last 14 years or so in the industry, where you've seen this growth as well. And what's happened really by now is that what was once this sort of outlier technological scientific experiment in the 1980s has become mainstream. The new black in pharmaceuticals, essentially. And what's happened now is that you have not just little biotech companies, but all the mainstream pharmaceutical companies, and lots of people in the industry now, most companies now have biotherapeutics and biological medicines in their pipeline. And so you're seeing more proteins and peptides being developed in science. You're seeing molecular engineering happening now, where they're fusing different proteins and parts of proteins together, and using biomarkers and all sort of cancer immunology science coming through. The regulations are developing as well. We're now seeing regulations on things like biosimilars and clinical trial complexity increasing. And you're seeing also the payers, the people we heard earlier, the payers who pay for this, whether they're governments or private insurance firms or whoever, HMOs, they're asking more questions about, great, you've got all these therapies coming through, but how do we know that they're value for money? And these are more questions that are coming out of the regulatory system. And in the pharmaceutical industry, you're seeing, if you like, consolidation of this. You're seeing what were some of the small biotech companies now becoming bigger pharmaceutical companies, names like Amgen, Celgene. You're seeing other biopharmaceutical companies growing their biotech businesses. You're seeing companies start to have corporate venture capital in biotech, where they invest in companies and do alliances. And again, at the other end of the picture, you have more therapies now available for patients than ever before in new treatment areas and better treatments. You've got new oncology drugs. We've got the next generation of diabetes drugs. You've got monoclonal antibodies in cancer. You've got the HPV vaccines. You've got pneumococcal vaccines. These are all biologic medicines that have come through this process that the community benefits from today. You have orphan drugs, many orphan drugs coming through as well. So again, this whole story is one of scientific change, business development, regulatory development, leading to treatment options for the community. And that's happened over the space of 30 or 40 years. And just to give you a bit of a sense of where that's happening, you can see that through the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, do we call them the noughties? No, we don't call them the noughties. And now, the 10s, you can see the pattern of development in biologic medicines. You can see the areas where, over those 30 or 40 years, there's been a lot of new medicines brought in the areas of things like endocrinology, oncology, other areas where infectious diseases, those sort of things, vaccines. These are all medicines that didn't exist 30 years ago. So while we talk about increased costs in the health system, and that's important issues to manage, we also need to keep in mind what it's all for. And what it's all for is that there are somewhere in the order of 260 new medicines and treatments that weren't around 30 years ago, that treat diseases that we couldn't treat 30 years ago in many cases. And that's an improvement in human health. And people are living alive today because of treatments like this. There's about 7,000 medicines in development overall, and roughly about 1,000 to 2,000 medicines in biologics in particular, depending on how you define it. And as I said, not all of these are going to come to fruition, but a lot of them are as well. And I'll finish with this chart, which I actually love. It's from Medical Futurist, and what they've tried to do is paint medical technology out to 2040 in different directions, if you like. So each of those concentric circles is a decade, and they've tried to future predict the sorts of health technologies that might be available in 2020, 2030, 2040. I don't expect you to be able to read all that here, but I encourage you to go and have a look at it on medicalfuturist.com. But in medicine and in biologic medicine, the sorts of things that are on the horizon are the next generation of drugs for multiple sclerosis. The first one, I think, has just been approved recently, but there's other ones in the pipeline as well, so the next generation for those, and there's some promise around that. Dermatology drugs. The next generation of oncology drugs. We've already seen immunotherapies and how that's changing the way that oncology is treated and managed, and more of those in the future as well. And of course, Alzheimer's drugs. There are medicines that are being in phase 3 trial at the moment, biologic medicines that treat Alzheimer's. And as you know, the industry spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money trying to come up with the next generation of Alzheimer's drugs. And there's a number of those in the pipeline that are biologic medicines and potentially offer new treatment options as well. So there's a lot of promise there. And biologics, medicines and biotherapies have played a big role in that. And the industry's had to adapt and evolve, and one of my jobs is to work with the industry as it does that going forward. And so there's a lot of promise there, and we're hoping that some of those medicines and treatments will come through and be the next generation, if you like, of treatments that will help future generations as well in treating disease. So I might leave it there and hand it to the next person.
Good afternoon. I have met quite a lot of challenges in my scientific career. This is another challenge, trying in 10 minutes to give you a focus on the biologic story. Nonetheless, we will try to do so. Just a little timeline as an introduction. It actually, one could say that in terms of biologicals, it started somewhere in the early 1900s, where von Behring and colleagues have discovered that when you inject an animal with a foreign protein, then you get an immune response. And this immune response, these agents, these antibodies that are being formed in the animal, actually have a potential therapeutic or preventive capacity. Lots of things happened afterwards, and I will point out, apart from this first milestone, the second milestone is the discovery or the development of procedures to specifically isolate antibodies that are directed against one particular target, not a total anti-serum, which is a very heterogeneous population of antibodies, but through hybridoma technology, Köhler and Milstein, who also got the Nobel Prize for that in '75, developed a method to very specifically generate clonal cell lines that produce one particular antibody. initially purely for research purposes. The third milestone is actually the discovery of the possibility to cut and paste genetic material, DNA fragments, recombinant DNA technology. This also has led initially to the very first biologicals for therapeutic use, such as, for instance, insulin. But we should also realize that the combination of the recombinant DNA technology and, for instance, hybridoma technology to generate antibodies has also expanded the number of possibilities to generate a whole variety of products that will never or would never have occurred in nature, but that by just synthesizing the appropriate genetic combinations, we can create any kind of protein, whatever we want, against whatever we think it might be useful. Just to give you a brief overview, and I will focus only on oncology and autoinflammatory diseases, just to give you an overview of the complexity of the diseases on the one hand and the potential possibilities that this may open to target particular diseases. And I would also like to refer to the previous speaker, where if we talk about tailored medicine, personalized medicines, for every sub-disease you may think of another molecular mechanism and design a better therapeutic, for instance. But then indeed the question is, how far do we want to go? Just if we look at oncology, for instance, in the middle we have the tumor cell. We can actually, by using monoclonal antibodies directed against particular tumor-specific surface bound antigens, we can specifically target the tumor cell, not just by adding a therapeutic antibody against, for instance, the tumor cell that may block the proliferation. We can also combine different antibodies targeted against different proteins that will bring actually the immune system, the immune cells, much closer to the tumor cell in such a way to improve the immune-based antibody therapy. If we look at the autoinflammatory diseases, you see a much more complex scheme. Don't worry, we won't ask questions about the details of these molecular mechanisms. Just to illustrate to you that there are quite a number of possible targets, cellular receptors on the one hand, cytokines on the other hand, that are important in this inflammatory processes. And for each of those receptors, or for each of those possible cytokines, one can think of developing a monoclonal antibody that will neutralize, for instance, these targets, and that may have a beneficial effect in particular diseases. Now, talking about monoclonal antibodies, that's, let's say, generally speaking, one of the most complex therapeutic proteins that are available. If we compare the size to illustrate to you the complexity, if we look at an aspirin, and believe it or not, but we have a very small dot here. This is the size of acetyl salicylic acid, the active substance in aspirin, and this is drawn more or less to scale. This is interferon, a relatively small biological, and then this is the size of a monoclonal antibody, which has a size of approximately 1,000-fold larger than that of a chemical molecule such as aspirin. So this visually illustrates that making a protein, making a therapeutic antibody that behaves the way we think it should behave will be pretty complex and will require quite some extensive biochemical characterization as well as some clinical evaluation, obviously. Now, talking about the complexity, it starts with, and I won't go into detail obviously, but it starts with generating this recombinant cell line that will produce, based on the genetic information that has been cloned, has been designed, making those cells, reassuring that on the long term you can reproduce those cells, not only today, tomorrow, but also within 20 years to ensure that the patient will receive the same material. Not only the cells are important, it's actually the entire process that will lead to ultimately your active substance on the one hand, which is the protein, the monoclonal antibody, and then, this is not the end yet, you also have to formulate it in such a way that it is stable and that it is in the appropriate form to administer it to the patient. And each of these steps is subjected to very stringent quality controls. That's also something we need to realize, especially within the pharmaceutical contracts. And here you see just a rough number of tests that need to be done to ensure that your product is adhering to the right quality, and which will also lead to a consistent product. And in that respect, I would like to remind you that whenever you talk about a therapeutic protein, be it a simple protein or be it a monoclonal antibody, you need to realize that we are dependent on a biological system, a cell that we have asked to produce, that we have programmed to produce that particular protein or antibody. And it's important to realize that this is totally different from a chemical vessel. In a chemical reaction vessel for a low molecular weight drug, we just put the reagents together, we control the temperature very well, and we will get what we expect to get, and we can predict this very well. For a biological, we depend on this living system, and this living system is extremely sensitive to external conditions, such as, for instance, the temperature. 0.5 or 0.2 degrees higher during the culturing of the cells may shift your biochemical pathways in a certain direction in such a way that you will get other end products. Other parameters such as the oxygen that is being present, glucose as energy sources, this may all or will all have an impact on the biological, the biochemical processes within the cell metabolism, and will have an effect on your end product. So it's very important to realize that it's not just important to have the cells, it's also important to know exactly which kind of process that you are using to ultimately produce the active substance, purify it, and formulate it as a real drug. So that's a very important paradigm, that it's the entire process that will determine the properties of your end product. So it's not sufficient to just analyze the end product. You need to follow up the entire process. So what does this mean in practice? And now I'm switching from, let's say, biologicals in general to biosimilars. You may realize that, obviously, when a patent expires, you can also produce a copy of an existing biological that is on the market. And knowing the complexity, knowing that the product, the quality characteristics of the products are dependent on the process, it's important to realize that when you want to make a copy of an approved biological, as a company, you obviously have no access to the entire process of the originator, of the reference molecule. You just can find in public databases, at the best case, the exact DNA sequence that has been used. You may have limited information on the cell type, but that's about it. You will not have details on the vector that has been used to build in this genetic sequence, and so on. So if you want to make, and here I have as an example infliximab against, for instance, inflammatory bowel disease and so on. If this is one product, you see here when you have the gene, the cDNA of infliximab, you will end up, if you know more or less what you're doing, you will end up with purified infliximab. If my colleague in the lab next door wants to do the same, and you know, once in a while I don't want to tell too much, so I don't tell them anything, just the sequence that I have been using, he or she, will definitely be able to clone that gene, to put it into an expression cell, to purify the infliximab, and he will also get infliximab. A third lab can also do something similar. You may notice that we have 3 times a population of infliximab molecule, but you may notice that there are some, at the first glance, it's 3 times the same. But if you look in very much detail, and if you're still fully awake at this time of the day, you may notice that there are some subtle differences. If you look into sufficient detail, you will find some differences. So this just illustrates that it's impossible, visually illustrates that it's impossible to make an exact copy of an existing approved biological. So you will have to go through a very complicated process to ensure that your copy is sufficiently close to the reference product. So that's why we talk about a biosimilar. And just as a brief illustration, this is information you can get from the European Public Assessment Reports, where they have some basic information on why the biosimilar has been approved, on what kind of grounds and what kind of studies that they have done. And you will notice, as we expect, and that's not a problem, but it's just something we need to realize, these are some differences that have been reported for an approved biosimilar in erythropoietin, a human growth hormone, and here, for instance, an antibody such as infliximab. Just to illustrate that it is indeed, in real life, impossible to make something which is exactly the same. It should be noted that when it's an approved biosimilar, it means that those differences that have been observed are assumed not to have an impact on the intrinsic quality, clinical efficacy and safety of the product. And it also means that if we talk about biosimilars and want to introduce biosimilars, we should realize that because of the fact that they are not identical, they are also not considered to be fully interchangeable. This does not mean that they have the same expected efficacy, but it's just a matter that we should not promote the switching of patients that have already been under treatment of the originator or vice versa. It's also important to realize that since we are dealing with biologicals, biological systems, complicated production processes, we have no guarantee that there are no changes that do occur during the life cycle of the product. Maybe relatively insignificant changes, but there is no need for a biosimilar to prove its biosimilarity after 5 years. So if there is a change in the originator, you may get with some differences that make them not really biosimilar anymore. For the sake of time, I will skip the last bullet. So I think more or less in summary, for biologicals in general, I think substitution or switching is contraindicated. It's very important that the physician should have a full control over the prescription of the drug, and that obviously also the patient should be informed on what drug he or she is being administered and why, if there would be a change, why there would be a change and what the potential implications should be. If we get several copies, several biosimilars of the same reference product on the market, it's also very important that we are able to trace back what product the patient has received at what particular time point. So that's why an appropriate brand naming is required, and that because of traceability, you need to report exactly and have registers where you can trace back which product has been delivered to which patients. And this should be done, obviously, at an international level, because patients are traveling all over the world these days, so it should be something that is internationally validated, and obviously the identification of the drug, as I mentioned, should be in such a way that it's unambiguously which product he or she has been administered. I thank you.
See how cleverly they do this. So thank you very, very much. I had the pleasure of speaking on a panel with with Professor de Klerk, not terribly long ago on the same topic, and he had, I think, about 30 minutes to deliver what he just delivered to you. And I will say he's probably the only person I know who could deliver such complex information in such a short period of time and to do it so well. But I think now, the next time I'm going to do it, we're going to give him 5 minutes and see what he can do. He's just demonstrated that he can do amazing things with a very short period of time. So who knows? No. So it is my pleasure, actually, now just to give you a bit of the patient perspective. And I'm going to pick up, actually, on some of the comments that Dr. de Klerk was talking about. Okay, so I think as you've heard, I actually head up the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. I also sit on the advisory board for the Rare Disease International, which is an international alliance of patient organizations. And as importantly, I am just immediately, well, I'm the past chair, but I'm just immediately off the board of the International Alliance of Patient Organizations and still do a great deal with them. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the patient perspective from both a developed and a developing country perspective. And I think, as you heard from Matthias, about of our 260, 70 members, more than a half now are coming from developed countries. So it's so important that we're engaging the patients and making sure that the patients have an active role in terms of healthcare decision making. But I think, as Professor de Klerk really pointed out, an informed patient is essential when we're talking about making decisions around, but also monitoring and tracking the use of medicines. And certainly, I think, I'm sure all of you know, innovation, not just in biologics, but innovation in healthcare, and whether it's from a diagnostic point of view all the way through to the management of it, is so very important for patients in terms of getting advancements in terms of healthcare. And biologics, of course, have been probably the biggest innovation. And sometimes biologics used in diagnosis, biologics obviously used in treatment, and increasingly we're seeing biologics, of course, being applied in terms of cures. So this is so important for us. I think the challenge, of course, in terms of the continued investment in terms of innovative therapies or innovations in biologics, I think, as you've heard here, is that it's not getting any cheaper. And these processes are not anywhere getting easier, despite, I think, the long time that we've had involved in it. So unlike chemical drugs, which at some point were, as we know, fairly simple to put together, and unlike some of the early biologics, these are becoming more complex, but they're so important. And certainly in rare diseases, without these therapies, most of our patients, the 5% that actually have therapies, would not be getting anything. So you can imagine that from a patient perspective, continuing investment in terms of development of biologics is so important. But as important, of course, is access to them. And I think it's no surprise to anybody that these therapies are coming in at a very high cost. High cost of development, high cost in terms of payers, high cost even in terms of impact to patients. And the challenge, and certainly I think, as Matthias would agree, the challenge is that we've got patients in low middle income countries that are now increasingly having access to health care and recognizing they have a right to health care, as we talk about the ethics of it. It isn't just that these medicines and these therapies should be relegated only to people in high-income countries. The challenge is, how do we make them available to everybody? And of course, now the costs and the differentials become even more important. But I think, as we have seen over time, it is not an insurmountable problem, nor should it be seen as a reason not to continue to invest, nor is it seen as a reason not to try to make them available to everybody. I think every patient would tell you that we believe that every patient should have access. And we've seen amazing things. We've seen what's happened in vaccines. How do you make vaccines available? Low-income developing countries. We've seen it in terms of insulins and how do we treat diabetes. Hemophilia is a big example. How do we make these products that have a range of products, how do we make them available so that they are accessible? Beyond that, of course, is that these are biologic products. They do require a lot of monitoring. They also require healthcare infrastructure in the healthcare system. And when Professor de Klerk talks about monitoring, we're not just talking about having, a pencil and a paper that we keep track of it. We're talking about fairly complex systems in terms of being able to make sure that we can track these. So there is this huge challenge in terms of continuing investment, making them available, and making them available across that spectrum. So we've got challenges, but as we know, even in high-income countries, it is not a slam dunk that patients are getting access to all these, and not all patients are getting access. So access for all patients is a huge issue. I'm going to give you the results of 2 surveys. We're developing a new toolkit in terms of biologics, and I want to give you a toolkit in terms of what the some results of surveys we've been doing. One is from developed countries, and I'm going to give you the information here is actually from our Canadian survey, only because we haven't got sufficient numbers yet from our international survey. And then I'm going to provide you with some information also from some interviews that we're doing in low and middle income countries. So I'm not going to go through all of this data. Basically, we have provided a survey to the patients, and these are all patients who are, in fact, taking biologics. Not all of them, obviously, are taking biosimilars, I think as Professor DeClercq says. And the challenge is, are biosimilars going to be the answer? Is biosimilars like generic medicines going to be the answer in terms of making biologics more accessible to all patients? And the answer is maybe. And certainly biosimilars were introduced at the expiration of a patent period to try to make more biologics available. But I think as we've heard, and what the patients are saying is that we need to make sure that we're introducing them appropriately, that we're introducing them with some of the appropriate monitoring, and that we don't want to put safety, quality for the patients at risk when we're introducing them. So in many respects, biosimilars coming in is not exactly the same as having the generics come into a chemical drug. And the patients kind of get that. Basically, what we see here is that the patients recognize that if they're getting access to a biosimilar, they should in fact be engaged in terms of that conversation. And I think, as we've heard, if they have the same scientific name, some of the concerns is that, yes, patients do believe that they're probably the same drug, so this is a challenge. That patients do believe that if they are being prescribed a drug, they should know what drug they're being prescribed, and that the clinician should also know. This means that they shouldn't be switched without having their consent. And interestingly enough, the question is, should patients be prescribed a biosimilar if in fact it's cheaper? And the answer is, as you might imagine, sometimes yes and sometimes no. It depends. But really, at the heart of it depends in terms of the patient and what is clinically most appropriate to the patient. They should not be switched just on the basis of cost. So this is, in fact, something that patients are recognizing and patients are speaking up on. Yes, patients recognize it's okay to use a biosimilar, and certainly patients feel more comfortable in terms of saying that it will be used if, in fact, there's informed consent, if there is appropriate monitoring, if we're tracking the adverse effects. So introducing a biosimilar, the same as introducing a biologic, requires a healthcare infrastructure and a healthcare system. So the investment has got to be made, and it isn't just a matter of, can I provide a biosimilar and expect that because it's cheaper, I'm going to make it available to a whole lot more patients. We've also got to invest in that system in order to be able to track it appropriately. And this is just a summary of some of the responses that we've got. And I won't go through all of it, but basically what you can see there is that patients are somewhat split. They recognize that the biosimilars are there. They recognize that they could and should be used, but they really want to make sure that they're going to be able to use in an appropriate fashion. Interestingly enough, about 60% of them said they'd be unwilling to switch from the originator to a biosimilar. And when we drill down and talk to patients, it really makes a lot of sense. We're talking about insulins. We're talking about intravenous immunoglobulins, where patients are using them. We're talking about anti-inflammatories. Patients are using them over a long period of time. They're using them chronically. They have become accustomed to them. Their bodies have been accustomed to them. And sometimes for many of the drugs, it takes a long time to get adapted to them. And so they don't want to have to switch. In fact, they would say the same thing. I don't want to switch from one brand to another brand because I may not have the same effects. And patients who have switched have sometimes experienced. And I know I spent many years in hemophilia, and we know one recombinant is not exactly the same as another. So patients recognize this. Which also says that about 60% of them said it could be okay if you have never been exposed to the original biologic before in order to take the biosimilar. What they do want to make sure, though, is that the information and the control is there so that we should not allow interchangeability. We should not recommend interchangeability. We also want to make sure that we're doing it on the basis of what is best for the patients and not just because it's cheaper. On the other hand, I don't think we're hearing patients say, no, we don't want to have access to it. Interestingly, we did 9-country stakeholder interviews, and these are just to give you some high-level information. We haven't fully analyzed all the information that comes out of it. And again, these come from interviews with patients, and as you can see from selected countries, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, India, Thailand, Iran, Ghana, and South Africa. So a slight range in terms of income levels and where they are in terms of their healthcare infrastructure and their access to medicine. And again, most of these patients would be informed patients, patients that are heads of their or parts of their patient organizations. And what you're getting is somewhat of similar kinds of response. That first and foremost, there has to be safety. And what they recognize as safety is the WHO guidelines in terms of how to approve a biosimilar. And they're also saying the most important thing is that we want to make sure that they're effective. Patients understand that, and that the clinical studies have to be a part of what we're doing in terms of approval. So we know that there are some countries in which there is a pathway which does not require there to be actual clinical studies, and the patients are concerned. Because they recognize, again, they're not identical. I think also in terms of what Professor de Klerk says, patients recognize the second thing that they're talking about is there has to be true monitoring in terms of safety and efficacy. I mean, they say this in terms of switching from one brand biologic to another, and certainly even more so than if they're using a biosimilar. And they want to be able to trace the adverse effects to a specific drug. They also recommend that there be direct patient reporting of serious adverse reactions. Do not necessarily have to wait for the clinician or for the reports to be collected passively. Patients want to be engaged in the approval process. We have in many, many countries have seen patients take a very active role in terms of engaging with their regulators. We've seen lots of patient organizations in every country, in many, many countries, in developing countries included, that have commented on the WHO consultations in terms of biosimilars. So again, most important that comes up is to be able to have unique INN names and brand name prescribing. What they also have said, and again, this is not to paint any kind of a bad picture in terms of clinicians, but what we do know is that the clinicians don't necessarily talk to their patients about biosimilars. I mean, even in developed countries, when we ask patients where they got their information about biosimilars, about 3/4 of them say they get it from the website. You know, less than a quarter will say that my clinicians have actually talked to me about it. And for the most part, when they come in and talk to their clinicians about it, they're not sure that their clinicians are fully informed, and that stands to reason. Not many of them have necessarily been given all of the information or been fully educated about it. The challenge then is that the patients aren't fully confident. And this is again coming from many of the developing countries where there is a high interest and a high desire to have access to biologics, but again, somewhat hesitant in terms of accepting the drug unless their physicians feel fully confident about it. Some of the concerns, of course, is that there is, in fact, not much understanding. We are not doing direct education to patients around it, and the patients then are asked to make informed choices, but they don't necessarily feel like they're both given the information or being involved in the choices. I think we could not, I think we come back to maybe that the important point, both in developed and developing countries, that patients do not want to have their therapies switched without their being involved, without their being informed, and without there being the opportunity to make sure they're fully tracked. So overall, I think what we're hearing from the patients is, first of all, involve us, make us part of that system, education from the individual all the way through to the system, have an opportunity to participate. We've had patients, you know, in India, in Thailand, who say, I want to be there at the regulatory stage. I want to fully participate in terms of understanding not only about how the regulations are done, I kind of like to be there when they're approving the drug so I can actually feel confident that they're doing the quality job. So this is actually, I think, a huge important area for patients, not just to have access, but to feel fully confident about it, and then also to make sure that they're fully informed all the way through to the individual usage. So this is, again, very early, I think, information. I will say is that we did a Biosimilars Toolkit that we put out maybe, well, published maybe about 4 years ago. The reason we're doing it again is that this field is changing very, very fast. And I would guarantee you the minute we get this toolkit out, it will already be out of date. So we know that the whole industry is moving very fast. And I think from the patient point of view, what we're trying to do is just to keep up and to make sure, though, that we're a part of the process as it moves forward. Thank you.
So should I stand down here? Yeah, okay, excellent. So, so that about sums up my slides. And I want to thank Durhane for the introduction, which kind of lowered the expectations of what I should be presenting, because I was at dinner with Axel 2 nights ago, and it was his birthday, and he couldn't talk when I got there. He's like, I can't do anything. And I said, well, how are you going to present? I'm going to be sitting in this audience, and you can't talk at all. He goes, you're going to have to present. And so I'm more than happy to do it, but I feel like I just joined a football team, and I got in the huddle. I don't know any of the plays, and they said, just run down the field and we'll throw you the ball. And so I want to thank Janice and her team for preparing me for this. And I really want to build off a couple of points that the previous panelists made, especially Dr. Markman and his excellent presentation. He raised a couple of issues that are key from the health economics perspective. And I just want to take, by show of hands, who's heard of a cost per quality adjusted life year? Does that sound familiar to anyone? Okay, and who hasn't heard of one? Okay, and who's sleeping? So the cost per quality is kind of the conventional way in which a lot of these health systems evaluate the value that you're getting for money for new medical interventions. And that's one of the true challenges that we're really talking about indirectly here, because we have some fantastic drug development that's going on. When I was a pharmacist starting out 20 years ago, I don't think there was hardly a single molecule on the market. There might have been something for MS at the time. You weren't really educated as a pharmacist on these things, and it's really been a dramatic change in the way that we think of the kinds of medications that are delivered to patients and the kind of education that healthcare professionals need, and the kind of challenges that the health systems are trying to address, especially from a health economics point of view, because as I alluded to, this cost per quality is a conventional unit for evaluating the kind of value you're getting for money by gaining 1 year of full health, let's say, a full quality adjusted life year. There's thresholds that are set in healthcare that basically give you an explicit, depending on the decision maker, like in the UK, there's kind of a threshold that they consider reasonable for reimbursing for new drugs, that when it's an incremental cost and an incremental benefit, it means it is by definition increasing the healthcare budget, unless you're going to give something up. So when you're talking about medications that could cost more than $100,000 per year, and you're looking at ways to try to value the gain from a healthcare perspective, it's a challenge for health economics when the conventional unit is cost per quality, and that's one of the talking points that I was presented with. This is if one of our objectives is to understand the value and challenges of innovation. We're on the cusp of a huge pipeline, and in my opinion, we have some advantage here, because although it seems like the complexity is only getting bigger, when we look back at a lot of revolutions, such as a computer, it used to be that a computer was hugely expensive, but we had to get through that initial phase of time and investment, and now we're currently trying to figure out how do we get the regulations more manageable in a healthcare system so that we potentially move the bar for the expectations for what the future generations are going to have to deal with. Because we can't use conventional approaches, and that's what economists are now confronted with. And when I think about the alternatives that are being used, some of the options that are being much more widely embraced are putting the patient at the center, because the patient is allowing us to better understand what they perceive the benefits to be And the quality doesn't encompass all of those different attributes of what's important about a treatment or a medication. To elaborate briefly on what a quality is, for those of you that don't know it, it focuses on the utility assigned to a health state, and then you multiply that by the length of time in that health state, and you essentially get what's called a quality adjusted life year. Now that focuses on health status. It doesn't take into account what patients might value, like time to get back to work or being able to continue working well on a treatment, different ways in which the treatment's delivered, length of time waiting for treatment, and then a number of other, and that's at the patient level. And then at the system level, we've got issues of access and equitability, and these all need to be integrated into the decision-making at the systems level. And ultimately, health economics doesn't make the decisions. It's the decisions makers and the societal values they represent that make these decisions. Health economics can only deliver some new methods, and there are methods being really heavily invested in, including an approach called multi-criteria decision analysis, which is one option for focusing on what's important to patients and other stakeholders in healthcare that's has been proposed a few years ago by groups in the UK, and it's being embraced a lot in the US as well for a variety of purposes. There's a relatively new institute that came about as a result of the Affordable Care Act called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, and they encourage the use of techniques related to that, also analytical hierarchical processes and ways in which you can integrate stakeholder input for different criteria or attributes, and you can generate relative weights or importance assigned to those attributes, those components that are relevant to biologics. You can do that with patients, you can also do it with clinicians, and you can get these relative values that those stakeholders assign to the different attributes, whether it's toxicity or safety, cost, and you can decompose some of these issues to really elucidate what is important to the stakeholder, and those are some of the elements that we're going to have to further develop as biologics become a more and more important part of the drug budget and the drug spend. So those are some of the challenges to health economics, and there's progress being made. There's also challenges to the healthcare system, as we've kind of heard across the, from an ethical point of view, from a patient perspective, from an industry perspective, and from a kind of academic health economics perspective. It's moving in tandem with these other challenges, but they have the body of evidence accumulates only over time, and we continue to develop that. So that's all I had to say for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. So we're going to have open it up in terms of discussion. So really appreciate each one of the panelists for their certainly their excellent background information, but also their insights. And what I'm going to do is maybe ask some questions here, a couple questions to the panelists just to get started. But really, we'd love to hear from you folks as well in terms of any thoughts or challenges or questions that you've got. Maybe I'll start with something that I think certainly was alluded to by everybody, but I think Professor Markman put it in very strongly in perspective, and that is we've got this growing gap between innovation, cost of innovation, both in terms of doing the innovation and bringing it to market and what it costs to market, and to some degree what healthcare systems can want to actually pay for. And then we've got patients across that spectrum who want to continue to have access, but also increasingly feel that impact in terms of the cost. So I'm going to ask, and maybe I'll start with you, George. What are your thoughts in terms of how do we actually continue to pursue innovation and at the same time address this gap, or can we?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest questions you can pose. It's interesting, and you mentioned that questions of priority setting are not just questions for the affluent societies and so the so-called high-income countries, but also the low-income countries. When they scale up their healthcare systems, they have to say, well, what should have the higher priority? And I think we need a multiple strategy. We still have a lot of waste, and there are initiatives like the Choosing Wisely initiatives where we try to focus more that we have overuse of healthcare resources, we have misuse of healthcare resources, so we free resources for those things that really have an added value for the patients. But as I said in my talk, I think we have to think more explicitly about what is important for our population, what do patients really need. And I think that's a challenge because I'm not sure, well, the pharmaceutical industry certainly tries to tackle those problems that are important to patients, because if it's an important patient problem, then it probably will be a good area to invest and then get revenues from the investment. But at the same time, they just focus on one part. And the question is, do they have the whole picture of the whole population health in mind, and even on a global scale? And I think they usually don't, and I don't think that's their job to have it. But then the health politicians, health policymakers, I have the impression that they are very often very reluctant to really think about what is more or less important, because, well, it's easy to say what is more important, but it's much more difficult to say, well, what could be not a priority, but perhaps a posteriority where we invest less. And for example, if you have, and that's one last thought we have to, I think, take into consideration, we have other important public spending areas apart from healthcare. For example, education. And at the same time, education is an important determinant of health. So if we want to improve the health of the populations, well, we should not neglect investment in health. So this is another important dimension that makes the considerations even more complicated and more difficult.
So brilliant. I'm going to actually ask Paul if he would like to take a stab at this question. I mean, we've heard George talk about prioritization and even suggesting that maybe there are other areas in which we should be focusing on and not just consider healthcare as the priority, but also the earlier thoughts in terms of disinvestment or de-emphasizing some areas. But any other thoughts you might have in terms of how do we solve this conundrum?
Obviously, I don't have the right answer on how do we solve this. But as has been mentioned, I think it's important for policymakers to make decisions on certain priorities. And from the experience I have within the national healthcare authorities, it is indeed very difficult to make a wise decision that is, let's say, evidence-based to set priorities. And there are all kinds of challenges in that respect. So it's a difficult societal issue, I believe.
Is anybody else? I mean, maybe, Matthias, I know you're not part of the panel proper, but I'd love to bring you into this. So from the patient perspective, should we be involved in prioritization? Is prioritization the way to go? Is there another approach that we can think about in terms of, you've had a lot of experience in terms of trying to improve access globally as well?
I think they're beyond the two approaches that have been called upon, like the prioritization approach and the negotiation approach. One looks at where on the line are we, the other looks at we have a process that we need to continue together, let's try to figure out where we're moving. Are we moving backward? Are we moving forward? Is it a general direction that we're taking? I think one of the strongest arguments from the patient's perspective, and that very much corresponds with what Georg just said, is how much do we really want to invest in the healthcare field? How much additional benefit is that going to bring to society? And let me add one more aspect. How much is a comprehensive system going to add to the sense of coherence, of social coherence in a society? That's a very important point we are seeing in social healthcare systems, that as soon as you start trying to take away the services that you have developed from the population, you will lose some sense of social coherence. Opposite, if you start building up a healthcare system, you can foster the development of a social, societal coherence. So we are not at the end of seeing the benefits of healthcare systems yet.
So let me follow up on the patient engagement perspectives, because some people have said patients should be part of that priority setting. Patients need to be much more involved in terms of these areas. I think as you've alluded to, and I think as we've heard as patients, well, how can we expect patients to do that? Patients will always say we want more. Patients will always say we want everything. And patients, if they're there on behalf of a specific disease, will always say, hey, it's my disease, and therefore we think that should be the priority. Is it a benefit? Should patients be engaged in this? At what level should they be engaged in it? Maybe I'll go to Brendan, because I know the industry is trying more and more to engage patients, and patients in every phase of that. So maybe you can help us from that perspective to start with.
Certainly, I think one of the trends in healthcare you're seeing generally, not just in medicine, but is the more activist consumer coming. So generations ago, the patient would just walk into the doctor and the doctor would just write a prescription. I remember my grandmother saying she didn't even know what the doctor prescribed her, but just all these pills, she didn't understand what they did. Whereas nowadays, more and more, you're seeing the informed patient who has already gone onto the internet to find out all information about what they have, what the options are. They walk in, and often you hear from doctors the comment that the patient's actually already done all the research that they can do and walked in with looking for different options. And we have informed consumers use the internet, Facebook, and those sort of things. So, and companies are grappling with that the same way I think the payers are. I think and I think it's a good thing. I think that it's if you like, the community starting to take control of its health, and it's a cause for some good, tough conversations sometimes. But I think that's important, and I think the industry has a role there in engaging that discussion in a sensible way. I think that's it's an important input into the future of the health system.
I would like to briefly comment, because if you talk about patient involvement, patient can be involved on different levels. And one level would be the individual patient who had already fallen sick. And we did 2 studies, one about personalized medicine, one about cost-conscious guidelines, where we tried to talk about prioritization in healthcare with patients. And this was not very successful, because these patients said, I want to have the best available care, as you just mentioned. And if it then comes to questions of costs or anything, they say, well, this has to be decided by the policymakers, by the politicians. But there is an important point where patients have to be involved. I think if we want to have a wise allocation of scarce resources, it should be evidence-based. And when you gather evidence, you have to measure outcomes. And I think one of the most important things we can learn from patients, what outcomes are important, what outcomes are more or less important, to really get patient-relevant outcome studies and really are able to assess the benefit and, of course, the risks of new innovations, and to make sure that it's not just new, but that it's really a progress for patient care.
So part of what I hear you're saying is that patients need to be consulted, they need to have input, but it may or may not work to have them actually be part of the actual prioritization or the actual allocation of the resources.
Well, that could be a third level, and these are patient organizations. The individual patient who is really sick, he is not in a good situation to think about priorities in healthcare and allocation of resources, but patient organizations who really gather the experience from patient groups, I think they can make a very, very important contribution to these kind of discourse about how we organize the healthcare system and how we make a wise use of finite resources.
Are there anybody in the audience here who would like to raise a question or has a comment that they would like to add to it? Happy to have anybody participate. We've got microphones as well. Don't want this to be a one-way conversation. Thoughts, questions, concerns that come to mind here? There we go.
I was interested in the patient questionnaire and their willingness or not to switch brands of biological. We were discussing evidence-based, and somebody mentioned monitoring adverse outcomes, but it's likely that if you have minor tweaks in the biological, you're also going to have some brands more effective than others, and that doesn't necessarily mean the original brand. So should we also be considering monitoring the effectiveness of brands, and should we be making that data available certainly to clinicians and probably to patients as well? And to think very big, should we also be looking at precision medicine and seeing whether certain brands work better with certain genetic groups of patients?
The first part of your question, I'm not sure whether I fully understood it, but you refer to differences between different branded products targeting the same target, for instance?
Yes, I mean, we were given the example of 3 different types of, I've forgotten what the medication was.
Infliximab, in that
yeah.
case, yeah.
So the third type, for instance, may be more efficacious in more patients than the first.
Well, according to the registration procedure, if biosimilarity has been shown and if it's approved as a biosimilar, we should not assume, and we are pretty confident about that, that there is no improved or differences in efficacy according to the statistical information that is available at the time of approval. That's something I have to admit. But a patient should not expect to, let's say, if he has not been treated yet, whether you get the branded or the biosimilar, that shouldn't make any difference at all in terms of efficacy and safety.
So what we often find with statistics is that when you really drill down, different groups of patients are responding differently. Now that could be across the board, but it could also be that minor tweaks to the molecule may affect it. It's just a comment, and
Yep. Well, I see the point, but you should make a distinction between, indeed, whether you look at biosimilars or whether you look at another brand name. If you compare infliximab versus adalimumab, for instance, there it's much easier or much more likely to expect some differences in subpopulations of the particular disease state. And obviously in oncology also, if you have tumors that are responsive to particular drugs and other not. But as long as you're comparing biosimilars versus the originator, one should not expect to see differences within subpopulations of patients for the originator versus the biosimilar. That's based on our current knowledge.
Yeah, hello. I recently did a piece of work for a client with some discussions with patients about attitude towards biosimilars. And one of the findings was that patients were quite suspicious of when doctors were prescribing biosimilars because they didn't want to feel that their healthcare system was treating them out of a better treatment, that they were saving costs in this way. And I think this was quite a sad reflection of misinformation, I think, to this particular set of patients. But I was then also thinking of maybe the larger picture as a sort of general mistrust towards big pharma or small pharma, however you want to look at it, and how that could be addressed maybe through increased transparency or consideration of alterations of R&D models.
I think the challenge, as you say, is that the lack of transparency, the lack of concerted patient education, and certainly it isn't just in developing countries, but it's right across the board, I think, as we've heard. And as you say, when patients don't necessarily expect that they're going to be patients, so it's not like we're studying up on this so that when we become a patient, we're fully informed and ready to make good decisions. So you're oftentimes thrust all of this at a time when you're really vulnerable. So I hear what you're saying. I think there are many challenges, and it does differ a bit in terms of, as you say, inherent trust. Do I trust? And in many cases we heard, like in some of the developing countries, do I trust my regulator? Do I think they've done a good job in terms of actually, approving the biosimilar? And in some cases, it's not just the biosimilar. Do I trust my regulator just to know what they're doing and doing a good follow-up job? Do I believe that? There are other companies that are coming in, and we know that in many countries, you can have generic manufacturers that are local to the country that in fact can get somewhat of a pass in order to bring their products in without going through the full regulatory process. So this can be a challenge for patients in terms of having trust. So transparency, engagement is important. I think, as you also say, though, is having greater transparency in terms of how the drugs are being, how your healthcare system is actually approving and making available your drugs. And it goes back, I think, to a bit what George was saying before, and that is the more that patients, as patient organizations, are able to come into the process and be a part of the approval review process, be a part of the educational process. We oftentimes say, to companies, to governments as well, and to payers, why don't you invest in the patient organizations? Because if you work with us, we can actually be a good intermediary to making sure that patients feel comfortable as well with the information. But if you don't support the patient organizations, then we're not able to actually provide that full support. So I think everything you're saying in terms of making sure that there is that transparency, that the information is there, and that the patients do have confidence in terms of what they're getting, or that they're getting something that is actually the best for them, regardless of that cost, I think is so very, very important. Yeah, Bernard.
Just to add to that, I think you're right. The community's confidence in that's really important. To Haynes' point, I think the regulatory standards and how the regulatory system assesses medicines is important. I think one of the issues we're dealing with internationally is fake medicines and the sort of prevalence there. And I think that sometimes gives rise to concerns as well as Haynes said, sort of the standards that are being used for those, for approving medicines. And I think that goes to the point of having good regulatory standards and implementing that around the world. The other thing with biosimilars is that quite a lot of the companies that are getting into biosimilars are actually the originator companies as well. So because of the complexity of the manufacture and the regulatory approval processes and the trials that are required, actually quite a few of the companies that are getting into that space are the innovator originator companies. So it's an interesting dynamic in terms of the industry and how that's evolving. So, but this is an evolving space, obviously, and I think as I think the awareness and as the information becomes more available, there'll be a more informed community, I think, around that, and informed payers as well, informed regulators as well.
Yes, may I also add with regard to the regulations regarding biosimilars, I think it is very important to recognize that what Doreen said in the very beginning of her presentation. We're looking at a completely new field of health information relevant to compounds. This is not about drugs as we have known them, something where you set up a lab and you produce something inside, and if you can take care that the hair of the employers is not falling into the pill, everything is fine. This is something where a large number of companies are very challenged in producing the right product, are very challenged in identifying the right cell line, where even the identification of a cell line may be depending on cultural choices. You all know about the pig cells in human medicines production, which are not accepted in Muslim countries. So this is a big issue in general, and if it is so difficult for medical doctors and for all, I mean, it was difficult for me to understand, imagine how much effort we need in patient organizations to really get across what biosimilars and biologicals are.
Other questions or comments there? Okay, otherwise I'm going to put another hard question to the panel. So, I mean, certainly from the patient's point of view, right, we're trying to encourage innovation. And Simon, I think, talked a lot about the challenges of how do we actually come up with the right added cost to the added value, I guess is a one way of putting it. But I really think at the end of the day is how do we guarantee that there will be, in fact, sufficient reimbursement to encourage the ongoing innovation. And I think for many of us, you know, how do we also then make sure that that innovation is going to be widely available? Because I think as the ethics of it are becoming much more a case, it's not going to be sufficient to say, okay, well, as you say, some of the old models where we'll charge a whole lot, we'll look for the patients or the countries that can afford it, and we'll recoup our costs on there, and then, you know, move on to the next molecule. So how can we continue to encourage that innovation? And is there a right way that we can make sure that there is, in fact, appropriate kind of return? Simon says, why are you looking at me? And I'm looking at you because I'm really going to ask you to answer.
Well, there is indirectly that kind of thing going on already. For instance, the Orphan Drug Act started encouraging a lot of this investment in the first place. The U.S. being a major market for pharmaceuticals, in a lot of ways, they incentivize the direction of the entire drug industry sometimes, by and large. And therefore, because you can market drugs at different prices in different parts of the world, the Ramsey pricing in economic terms, it is possible to get these drugs at a lower cost to countries or systems that can't afford them at the cost that other countries, developed countries, are paying for them. The extent to, and then indirectly, those countries are, the have countries are underwriting the have-nots, and that's something that I think a lot of developed countries value as a society. Now, the extent to which you underwrite them and it is another issue, but you can see by a lot of things that have been done with global medicines and population health, there's a lot of willingness to do that. It's just almost a different league, though, when you're talking about 5 to 6 figure drugs. And so it kind of elevates this to a different level of equity and access and all those things that we can consider ethical about healthcare.
Okay, I won't challenge you by asking you what you think either of your presidential candidates would actually say in terms of the developed countries underwriting the cost of the drugs for the developing countries. So I won't put you on that spot, Simon, but you might think about it. Yes, Brendan.
I just want to clarify, I'm Canadian, not American, so...
And I'm Australian, so I'm not getting into that either. So, but what I will say is that I think it is one of the big challenges for this century. Actually, is how we grapple with this conundrum of high-cost medicines on one hand, and they are high cost. You know, they're new technologies, they have great new benefits. I spoke about some of the drugs that are coming through, and balancing healthcare costs as well. I think it's one of the great challenges we're going to have going forward, and we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and if you look at those, there's that tension buried in there in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and if we get that balance right, we'll actually have a much better public health outcome, I think, both in terms of getting the new therapies developed, getting them developed, and then getting them to the community. And that's that tension, I think, the balance between the two. And from the industry's perspective, there's a lot that's being done, and one of the fascinating things for me is to watch how the industry is evolving and developing those things. So there's, I think there's over 300 partnerships, for example, on access to medicines at the moment, where companies are partnering with different organisations around the world to improve access to medicines in a range of countries. You're seeing industry declarations on neglected tropical diseases, on antimicrobial resistance, industry initiatives already announced on things like non-communicable diseases as well. All these are about improving access to medicines across the world in different ways. And we heard about differential pricing, where companies will price at different levels in different countries. And we're starting to see that happen more and more. There's some policy barriers to stop that happening, which is interesting. That's a conversation we can have at another time, but there's actually some regulatory and policy barriers that actually stop that from happening, but we can talk about that. And you're seeing companies also, I think, start to adopt strategies around pay-per performance. So we talked about value before, and we're seeing companies starting to come up with innovative solutions and policies, and they're going to payers and saying, you know what, if this drug works, then you can pay us. Or if we meet this outcome, then we have two prices almost, an initial price, and then, but if it works, if it does what we say it's going to do, then we'll agree on a higher price. And there's some strategies that companies are coming up with to do that. And they're also looking at their own internal processes, the efficiency of their R&D pipelines. There's been a lot of work done in different companies and across the industry about that. I do want to say also, though, I think we do need to look at the levels of R&D, of health investment across the world. You know, we live in a world today where, so far, if my numbers are correct, humanity has invested $35 billion in curing hepatitis C, but has invested $640 billion on the next generation of fighter plane. Now, you know, we can debate whether the relative cost and benefits, what the cost per quality of a jet fighter is versus a cure for hep C, but that's the sort of, you know, if we're happy to invest in the internet and in the next generation of fighter planes, then we should be talking also about the world's preparedness to invest in the next technologies to cure disease. Because we've seen already the benefits that happen to date. There are millions of people living today, millions of people not dying as a result of investing in health. Vaccines to cure pneumococcal disease and malaria and those sort of things. So the question there is how society values this going forward. And I think that's a big debate we need to have as well as looking at some of the other system barriers. So the number of stories I've heard of companies that have donated drugs for free to countries, and then they're sitting on the wharf because the transport system's not set up to transport those drugs out to, you know, various parts of the country. So I think there's a lot of issues there, but I think it's through partnering with different sectors and people working together on these thorny issues that we're going to solve some of these problems going forward.
Perfect. So that was actually quite a comprehensive answer, and I think it gives me a great deal of actual, I think, hope based on what George said earlier, and that is, number one, industry working together, so across different companies. Second, taking, as you say, that big perspective, so not just focusing on what's that next drug, et cetera, but understanding that there's a whole health infrastructure and a public health issue globally that needs to be taken into consideration as we're moving forward. And I think that is something that obviously we're not saying industry alone, but that's something that I think falls to all of us. So I think we know that people are also very keen in terms of being able to make it to the reception that's taking place, and we appreciate all of you having been here. I'm going to sort of just end, I think, with maybe a final question to each one of the panelists who, what action would you recommend, going forward? And I think we've heard a great deal of very, robust discussion, and I don't say that, anybody here was actually sort of challenging each other so much, but recognizing that we're all challenging what is a very difficult situation in terms of wanting to have and wanting to invest more and more in innovation and making and understanding how important that is, wanting to make sure that they're also available to patients, but also recognizing that patients have an important role in terms of both contributing to the understanding at the big level, but also at a personal decision-making level. So what's your recommendation if you were to say one action that your sector could take, so whatever sector you're coming from, that could help us in terms of assuring that we're going to continue to have innovation if that's what we want, we're going to continue to try to make it so that it is in fact going to be accessible and sustainable and across whatever population you want. So maybe I'll start with George.
As I already mentioned in my presentation, I would encourage a larger investment in post-licensing studies. So further evaluate medications, innovative medications that have come onto the market, to really get more valid knowledge about the added benefit and risks. So that's in the interest of the patients, of course. But it can also be in the interest of the decision maker, because this could be a more solid basis for then have price negotiations with the pharmaceutical industry.
I think it's continuing to be innovative, both in the development of new medicines, but also in the way that you're providing them to the market or the community. I think there's some interesting trends happening. And that tension I talked about, that great challenge of being commercially successful and providing access, I think there's a lot of new opportunities that are there, and I think as the industry invests in those and invests in its medicines, I think there's more that can be done to help achieve these UN health goals we have for the world.
I would like to come back to the remark of looking at patient outcomes and what do we look at. And I think we are still looking too much at pure clinical laboratory measurements, biochemical data, from which it is concluded the patient is getting better. Biochemically, according to some biomarkers, he may be getting better, but this may not reflect what the patient experiences as being better. So I have the impression that once in a while we invest money in trying to get those parameters, those laboratory parameters better, but ignoring a little bit the feeling of the patient, basically.
I like those responses, and I want to build upon the idea of the generating evidence, continuing to build the evidence and having explicit decision-making criteria so that both, everyone knows that we're not working from a black box. Industry needs to know what kind of benchmarks they need to reach, and decision makers can't be doing everything behind closed doors and improvising all the time. And then we know what we have to improve upon, whether it's methods or more evidence being generated, because uncertainty is an issue.
Matthias, I'll let you speak on the patient.
Let me say something on the patient side. The first step I would like to take is really convince policymakers to start with considerable structural investment in patient organizations. I think without that, we're not going to get anywhere. Thank you.
So thank you very, very much to the panel. I think we've kind of gone all the way from what we need to do in terms of a global level. Certainly we've heard some huge, I think, support in terms of the ongoing investment in innovation, but recognizing that there's a lot of issues that we need to be addressing along the way to ensure that these products are going to not only be brought to market, but they're going to be brought to market in a sustainable way, use appropriately, and that we're able to, on a go-for-it way, be able to demonstrate what the value is. I'm going to leave one last challenge for everybody, which we don't need to answer now, but really, I think for us, I think what I've heard here is that the patients can be engaged and need to be meaningfully engaged, but the challenge is really going to be how do we make sure that we bring that patient and that patient organization into the equation. So thank you folks very, very much on the panel for such an engaging conversation. Janice, did you want to have any closing remarks here for us?
Actually, I just really want to say thanks to everybody for speaking today, especially those of you who came the last minute. Really appreciate it. And everybody else who traveled. And I think this has just been a really good panel. We've heard a lot of things about, explicit priorities, sessions, pipelines, investment, and the patient-centered approach. So I hope you will take something back as much as I did. And I just want to say thanks again. And to IAPA for co-hosting. Thank you very much.